poor for our sake, that we might be made rich through your poverty. Guide and sanctify, we pray, those whom you call to follow you under the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, that by their prayer and service they may enrich your church, and by their life and worship may glorify your name. For you reign with the Father and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. All right, folks, well, this is officially, supposed to be officially, the final class from my our journeys with Jesus, which was just some name I tried to figure out, give it a name, give it a title, other than the title of, hey, come listen to me tell my story. I've been working hard to connect with your stories, and I know it's working because some of you have pulled me aside or sent me emails or written me letters to tell me how it connects with your story, and I really appreciate that because that's really the goal. As you know, as I'm going to say in my sermon today, I wanted to make myself more acquainted with you, but I always want to do that in a way that helps all of us grow in faith a little bit as well. So the good news is that I've come to an ending point because I'm just about to the last few years. All of us have lived through COVID, so therefore I feel no need to give you a whole lot of stories about that. What I want to kind of wrap up my time with before I invite you to ask me questions and find out the rest of the story that I didn't include in my story, or what I've told you so far. The part I want to end with is 2019, when I had the blessing of taking a sabbatical and spending some time in that sabbatical to sort of help me build up my faith. And that involved a time with a monastic community in South Carolina. So I'm going to jump right into that because as we ended last week, I had talked to you all about my call to Florida and about going to be the rector of All Saints Episcopal Church down there in Jacksonville, which, as I think I laid out for you, was a perfect match for someone who'd been through his own struggles to come into a parish that had its own struggles. And really, we worked together really nicely in helping each of us on both sides, priest and parish, really learn about God's love, forgiveness, and God's vocation and call to all of us. And the beauty of when you stay at a parish a good long time is that they give you a sabbatical. And I had been at All Saints for 6 years, going on 7 years, and went through the struggle that every rector does. In fact, I heard your last rector had been with you long enough and didn't follow through on the sabbatical. I was close to that because I thought, you know what, I could go in 2019, or I'll just wait till 2020 and go on sabbatical then. And God did something to say, maybe you shouldn't wait till 2020, and I'm thankful God did, because as we all know, I had a different kind of sabbatical in 2020, which was terrible and not the sabbatical I wanted. So I made the decision to go in 2019. And sabbaticals, for those of you who have had the wondering glory of doing that, which generally is in the academic world, maybe in some of your careers you have that opportunity too. But you've got, it's hard to think about taking 2 to 3 months off from your work and just wanting to go take it easy. Now, they always tell you that needs to be part of it, that the whole point of the sabbatical is to help you refresh yourself physically and mentally as well. But I really wanted to add something into my sabbatical that would really send me back as a better priest and a better spiritual director and someone walking with my parish in their own spiritual journey. So it just so happened that I happen to be one of those people who like silence. Not everybody likes silence, but I really do like silence. And I have always enjoyed going to monastic communities. And for those of you who may be new to the Episcopal Church and may think that monasteries and convents are only for the Roman Catholics, that's not the case. The Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion, at least since the early to the middle of the 19th century, has had religious communities. In fact, the prayer I just offered was for monastic orders and vocations out of our own prayer book. And it is for those who have chosen to live in community and follow what Benedict and Dominic and St. Francis and all of those set up in the Western and the Eastern churches from the beginning of religious life. And that is monastic communities. I used to go, I might have said this last week, I can't remember, one week to the next, it's hard to remember what's going on in this parish. Busy, there's lots going on. But I did used to go, well, one of the first places that I went to was the Society of St. John the Evangelist, which is a men's monastic community in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and one of the oldest, the first one to be established in the Anglican Communion in England long ago, and it came across to the States again in the 19th century. Those of you who are like me and have one of those degrees for the English literature, like I do, may know the poet T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot had a very profound conversion experience at the monastery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, around the turn of the century, and became a very highfalutin Anglo-Catholic type of Anglican when he went to England and continued to write his poetry. That was a place I went to right before my ordination and spent some retreat time, and I've been back there a couple of times since. Also, when I had my first parish in Kentucky, I was happy to discover that the Community of the Transfiguration, which is a group of Anglican Episcopal nuns, was just up the road on the north side of Cincinnati, Ohio, in a place, a little community called Glendale. And the sisters there were wonderful. They were all aging when I would go to visit them, but they never seemed to fade out because they just bring in more sisters when women got to a certain age and they'd come into that community. They were always very welcoming. They were one of those communities that at one time in Glendale, and I think they still have a private school there. At one time the nuns would have been the teachers, as you would expect in the Catholic tradition of education. But of course, as they've gotten older, they brought in teachers, and so it's become a private Episcopal school in Glendale. They were always happy to welcome me, and I always enjoyed going to stay with the sisters there. So I checked out, when it came to my sabbatical, the idea of going to one of the Episcopal monasteries. There's also one in New York called the Community of the Holy Cross. There's St. Gregory's up in Michigan. There's quite a few religious communities in the Episcopal Church. But as I looked around, I discovered that Mepkin Abbey in South Carolina had a program they had just started the year before called the Monastic Institute. And I, of course, am a big, big fan of Thomas Merton, who was a Cistercian monk from the early part of the 20th century. He's been one of the great, I would assume he's a saint, even though the Catholic Church hasn't quite proclaimed him as such. He was such a great writer, prolific writer in the 20th century, probably one of the greatest spiritual writers of that particular time, along with C.S. Lewis and a few others. And Thomas Merton, of course, was known for his book, Seven Story Mountain, which just had an anniversary recently, which was how ever a man who's in his late 30s decides to write an autobiography. Seems like he's got a whole lot of life still coming. But his autobiography, for those who've gone through it, is about his conversion and his call to the Trappist Monastery in Kentucky, which of course is my home country. So that was a big connection with me as well. So I've been to Gethsemane on retreat there, and I'd actually been to Mepkin Abbey the first time I went down to Jacksonville to work at St. Mark's Episcopal Church. The rector there knew I was from General Seminary, and General Seminary is one of the seminaries in our church that is known for its high liturgy and being part of that, what was at one time called the Anglo-Catholic movement, though I would say General's not really Catholic anymore. But he thought he'd take me to Mepkin Abbey for a retreat, he and I together, and that was my first discovery of Mepkin Abbey. So when I found out Mepkin, which was just 5 hours up the road on the north side of Charleston on the Cooper River, had this monastic institute that ran through the months of late June into late July, I thought this is an excellent thing to add to my sabbatical time. So I applied, and the monks accepted me, and I was able to come in with, I think, 15 or so other folks to be part of this monastic tradition. And that's what I wanted to share with you as one of the last big exciting moments in my most recent times through my sabbatical time.
Put it on.
It is on. I'll point it in that direction. Say the magic word. Hey, lip. I got it turned on.
Hit the right button.
Oh, there we go. Look at that. Okay. Ooh, it just flew right through there. Okay. Okay. Well, we'll just stop at Our Lady of Mepkin. Okay. So this is a good image of Mepkin Abbey. It is a traditional Cistercian monastery. The Trappist who came out of the Benedictine order. I won't spend a whole lot of time educating you in Christian Western monasticism, but Benedict of Nursia begins the monastic tradition in the Western Church around the 6th century by putting together his rule of life and then bringing men together. Out of the men's order grows women's orders, and that's where it starts. And then it begins to have some reform. The Cistercian tradition, also known as the Trappist because of La Trappe, where one of the monasteries was located in France, was a reformed movement of the Benedictine order. They thought the Benedictines had gotten a little too highfalutin and fancy. So the Cistercians under Bernard of Clairvaux, there's St. Bernard's Monastery, just south of Pullman, Alabama. St. Bernard helped to reform the Benedictine order. They started their own community of Trappist monks or Cistercians. And the Cistercians arrived in the United States in the early 19th century at Gethsemane, where Thomas Merton would go to and become the most famous of Trappist monks in Kentucky. But once they were there around the early 19th or 20th century, they began to send monasteries out around the country, probably in the late 18th century or 19th century as well, early 20th century. And one of those in the 1950s they started was Mepkin Abbey, which is coming up, I think, in 2024 on its 75th anniversary. And so they had so many monks. If you've read Thomas Merton's autobiography, I can't remember if he talks about just how many people were joining monastic communities in the early 20th century. It's hard to imagine that in the early 20th or 21st century. And after Merton's book comes out, they're overrun by monks and people who want to join the monastic community at Gethsemane. So they begin to pick up people and send them out to build more monasteries. And one of them they build is Mepkin here in Moncks Corner, South Carolina. And this is a picture of your new rector wearing really cool sandals. Just check out my feet there. I mean, if you're going to a monastery, you should wear sandals, right? But it was also July in, late June, early July in South Carolina, close to Charleston. Hot. And so I also have, you can't see the zippers on my pants. So when the monks weren't looking, I could unzip them a little bit, let a little hair flow in there. I needed it desperately. But they gave us, and part of the monastic institute was to give you the feeling of living as a monk. So they even gave us monastic robes of sorts, kind of halfway. They didn't want anybody to mistake you for a real monk, so they cut it off about midway down. But that was it. So we wore those, and we were called upon to put those on anytime we came into the chapel or to eat or to gather as a community. They didn't expect us to wear those, thank goodness, when we worked, and they didn't mind if we wore shorts then, and you'll see a picture of that. But this was the moment after the weekend I'd been there sort of signing, making my vows to stay at the monastery. I'll never forget arriving there late. I don't know why I was a little late the day when it started, and getting into the monastery and thinking to myself, you know what, I'm just going to rush there so I don't miss the opening event that was planned that afternoon at Mepkin. And I thought, I'll run back out and get some toothpaste after it's over, because, you know, I haven't committed myself yet, so the monks won't mind if I jump in my car and drive back to Moncks Corner to go to Walgreens. Well, so I did all of that. I jumped in my car at about 8 o'clock that night. I'll just slip in there, they'll never know I'm gone. And I started to head down the gravel road and discovered that they put a gate up. You were not getting out of the monastery in the evenings, and I thought, what have I done to myself now? So that was the beginning of it. And I had, you know, moments of struggles throughout it. I want to give you some more images. This was what's known as the Horarum for the monastic community. This is one later on. I have a different one here I'm looking at from when I was at the Institute. But it gives you a sense of what the Cistercians were all about. The end of those who are monks is OCSO, which is Order of Cistercians of the Strict Order. And so they're very strict, and their approach to prayer, as you can see, is 7 times a day. And if you were going to live into this community, you were expected to take part in it. They did tell us that if we did not make it to the 4 a.m. vigils, that would be okay. But at 5 a.m. we were expected to be in the chapel near the retreat center to have 30 minutes of centering prayer, followed by 30 minutes of Lectio Divina, a short time to go have breakfast, and then to get into the church for lauds, which is morning prayer at 6:30 a.m. So we would follow that order. It would be followed immediately. 7:30 was still the Eucharist. Immediately after that, we had a really short order of terce, which was just a short set of prayers that follow a time of quiet and silence after the Eucharist. And then we would go meet in the chapter room of the monastery to get our set up for work of that day. But I just wanted to give you a few images. This was my office. This was my room I stayed in, by the way. So just in case you think it was really hard, you can just see this was my room that I got to stay in, which is the retreat center at Methven. So if any of you want to ever take a monastic retreat, look at the beautiful setup they had. They redid their retreat center back in the last decade. It's a beautiful place to be. And this was my setup. This was my monastic set of rules that I had to follow every day. And Audrey and Aoife were still in Ireland because I'd spent the first month of my sabbatical with them in Ireland. And I had strangers in the city, which is by Cistercian, from Australia, and my notepad. So, and I had my raisinets, because you know even the monks were okay with you having a few snacks. Because, as I'll tell you in a few minutes, the hardest part of my time at Methven was that Cistercian monks are vegetarian. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But I just put in a few photos of what life in the chapel, the church of Methven, the abbey as it's called, looked like. Very modernized Roman Catholic setup there. And really in the order and form of the Cistercian setup, which is to keep everything simple. The Cistercians don't have a whole lot of stained glass windows because they want to be able to see out into the beauty of God's creation. So they really fit well with the opposite of what we think of in a lot of Catholic setups, with a whole lot of beautiful gorgeous churches filled with gold and silver and all of that. The St. Bernard said the best idea of God's love and creation is in nature. So I've got some photos here that will show you that. This was one of my proudest areas, which was to get my own place in a stall, a monk's prayer stall, which had little folding chairs, stand up and sit down. If you think the calisthenics of our church are rough, you don't go to a monastery, because you're sitting and standing and kneeling and sitting and standing and kneeling a whole lot more. It's a good image of us in prayer, and if you think our prayer book and hymnals all have a lot to deal with, look at all that. I've got another picture coming up. This was my own stall there. What's that? It was very quiet with my cell phone. You notice that Father Kevin's not looking at me. He's looking away. So I might have snuck in it. But, you know, I was also wanting to get pictures to share with people. So if the Abbey was empty, some of these pictures are from the empty Abbey. But a few of them, I just wanted to capture the moment. You know, I knew that I may not ever do this again. And the sense of the monastic life, being in that community with the brothers of Methven, was so moving for me that I just felt like I had to take a photo of it. It's like going to a music show now. There's more cameras in the air than there are lighters anymore. Remember the lighters in rock concerts? Okay. Anyway, so just a sense of
of all the varieties of text and books and worship and psalmody that we had at Mepkin to follow. Because again, if you're going to pray 7 times a day, you got to mix it up and make it exciting. And the monks did that. We went through every psalm, all 150 psalms, in 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks we've gone through and recited every single psalm in the Old Testament. And we made and so it was all part of that experience. So this was a good example. All of us in the slightly yellow robes are part of the Institute, along with a few novice monks who are in the white, longer robes. That's Father Columba up there next to me. He was from Ireland, so he was from Dublin, so he and I clicked really quickly. And even though monks don't talk much, they're not supposed to, Father Columba would sneak and talk to me quite often when I was sitting there waiting, which I enjoyed. And of course, the monks who've made their full vows had the black scapular over the white. And the black is their reference back to Benedictine tradition. Benedictine monks wear black robes. I'm sure all of you know this, right? And Cistercians have the white with the black over top. And then us strange little people got to wear a slightly yellow one. But cool. But once we finished prayer, we went into the chapter room to receive our work order. And they were raising mushrooms at the time at Mepkin. At one time, they raised chickens. That went out the window. They switched to shiitake and oyster mushrooms, in which they sold all over the south part to restaurants in South Carolina. When I went back a couple of years later, they lost the shiitake market and were only making oyster mushrooms. But my goal was to get put into the area that you got to cut the mushrooms up, because it had air conditioning in it and was very indoors. But apparently, even though I was the oldest of this group of young guys, I was still too young to stay inside. So I got put on what they did with what was left over after they chopped the mushrooms off. They threw it into this grinder, this big John Deere grinder that looked like it was from the 1950s. And the monks said, if you fall into this, you will not come out of it. Or actually, you will come out of it, but you will not come out of it alive, is what they were trying to say. There's no safety precautions on this, so don't get too near to it when it's running. That was frightening. But what it spit out was this wonderful organic mushroom mulch. And then it was up to me and 3 other much younger guys, much stronger guys, to bag it up into those bags, to step on it, to get the air out of it, to put it in these little sealers that would seal the top of it, and then to stack it. So that's what we did. Here's our group of guys, and you can see the monks did not make you wear a robe when you were working. This was about half a mile walk away from where we stayed, and there was a pond behind it that had some of the largest alligators I'd ever seen before, out in the free world, not in captivity. So it was frightening. So we worked through all those big piles and stacked up what we amounted to is about 1,000 bags of mushroom mulch to be sold at the monastery. And the monks came and looked at it and said, Brother Joseph usually has this done, has 1,000 done a week. It took you guys a month to do 1,000 of them. Well, we didn't uphold our vow of silence as we should have. We talked a lot about Game of Thrones, I remember. And then we went back to silence. But it's a good example. I had to take pictures to prove to my wife I actually did some physical labor. And to my parish, and wanted to know that. But good example of what we did. After we worked, we studied. So it became, most of the time I go on retreat to monasteries, it's all about retreat time and quiet and walking around and doing the labyrinth or walking. Mepkin had a wonderful, grounds to walk around and to explore on the Cooper River. In this monastic institute, we went to study. We literally worked from 9 o'clock till noon. We rushed in for noonday prayer. We had about 20 minutes to take a quick shower. We'd rush into the Abbey for noonday prayer service, I think at 12:15 or 12, let's see. At noon, we do midday prayer. Then we'd rush and have dinner. The biggest meal of the day was at lunchtime. And then we would immediately go from there into this big, wonderful library they had to do a period of work with a couple of folks they brought in. This was Sister Margaret, who was a Cistercian monk from Australia, and she led us through Benedict's Rule, which is, you can blame Sister Margaret when your rector talks about St. Benedict and his rule a lot, because it's her fault. She taught it to us. And we spent 2 weeks studying that. Then we studied the Cistercian tradition with Father Thomas Davis, who was at the monastery of New Clairvaux, close to San Francisco in California. He had gone into the monastery in 1953, I believe, and had been a novice under Thomas Merton. So I had to touch Father Thomas because he had touched Thomas Merton. So there I am with Father Thomas, and he taught us about the Cistercian tradition. Then we'd go have small group. So we'd finish there, we'd rush over to our own rooms, and we'd have these small group discussions with a couple of the monks and members of our own group, which was really good as well. I had Father Kevin, who was the novice master at the monastery. He's a wonderful guy. And all of the monks were wonderful, and this was a selfie time there. And then after that, we finish up there. We just have enough time to go and get ready for Vespers, or dinner at 5 o'clock. And I'd always have to rush and do Scola rehearsal, because they found out I could sing, and if you had a voice, they wanted you to sing in the Scola. So what I'm trying to explain to you is I never had any free time at the monastery. It was always ordered, and it was structured, and I'd rush in for supper. Supper would generally be whatever was left over from lunch, and then we'd rush to Vespers at 6 o'clock, and at 6:30, we rushed back over to the retreat center to have another bit of discussion time with one of the monks, and then we'd fly out of the dialogue with our presenters at the retreat center back to Compline. It would happen at 7:30, with the idea that you'd go to bed somewhere around 8 o'clock to 8:30 in order to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I usually found that the only free time I had was after Compline. So I would go back and read a book or stay up a little bit longer, and then I'd have a terrible time getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning. So it's a good example. The other thing I'd share with you is the other great memory was eating at the monastery. Again, as I told you, they were vegetarians, which was probably the greatest struggle I prepared myself for, not being a vegetarian myself. But one of the things I loved was eating in silence. We never were allowed to talk unless it was a special day during our breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And at lunchtime, which was the big meal, someone would read a book. I think while I was there, there was a book on spirituality that actually was by an Anglican writer that they were reading from England, and then they switched over to the biography of Pope John the 23rd, which is not nearly as interesting to me as the other one had been. But it was still what was read, and whoever would be the reader would sit at the station and read to you, and the brothers would bring him out food that he would eat after he'd finished reading at the end of the dinner hour. And we'd finish there and do another set of prayers, and then we'd head off to get ready for study. But I have great memories and love sitting here. When I went back on a retreat after COVID had reprieved itself just enough that the monks would let you back in, I was so happy to go sit at those tables. It's probably one of my warmest moments was going. So let's talk about meals. So they always had a sign up that I always enjoyed. So just in case you think monks live hard, read this menu. This was their the setup for the 25th of July. It was Mexican Abbey mushroom shepherd's pie, which I remember being really good. Fried green tomatoes with peach and fig chutney. Hard life of a monk. That there. Max 3. Nobody's allowed more than 3. Then we had seasonal salad. We had summer fruit cup. And that was our main meal. Now you might come back and have leftover shepherd's pie made with the mushrooms that evening, and you might see it again the next day for your later meal. But it was still food well eaten. I put up a picture of St. Benedict because on the Feast of St. Benedict, which is around that day, it's earlier in July, the monks had a big party. For that, you were allowed to talk during the dinner hour, and they gave you some wine, which was always wonderful. What is that flying around? Oh, yeah. And then this was an eggplant parmesan, and I ate way too much of it. So it came back to haunt me later on, but that shall not be discussed amongst good people. Much better of a dessert there. I wanted to show you what we got on the 4th of July. These were vegetarian hot dogs, so don't get too excited. They were vegetarian hot dogs, but they wanted to honor us and honor the 4th of July holiday, so we got a little bit of that. And I think the next one is my favorite meal of all, which was our final dinner we had with the monks. And that was pizza they ordered from out of town. Pizza and beer, which was a wonderful addition. There is in the discussion a theology of beer that will be coming soon to St. Thomas. It's my attempt to get guys to come in and talk about the Bible. And just so you see, I got that from the real source, monks drinking beer. There you go. So, and they make really good beer too, though this was not. They don't make beer at Meccan, they make So we had to work after we finish up with dinner each and every day, so I was really on the cleaning duty. I haven't told anybody in the kitchen there that I know how to operate all that equipment because they had the same stuff at Meccan, because as soon as I tell them that, Alexander's going to expect me to go in there and wash the dishes on Sunday morning, which I'll be happy to do. I wanted to rush through this. This was a statement I wrote down on silence. I meant to take this out, but now you've seen it, so therefore I shall read it to you, because it's in my own terrible handwriting. But it's from Callisto Ware, who passed away not too long ago and was a bishop in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And it was about silence and the importance of it, because silence, I would argue, is one of the most impossible things in our current culture today. But Bishop Callistos wrote, silence is not just negative, an absence of sound, a pause between words. Silence is positive. Not an absence, but a presence. Not an emptiness, a void, but a fullness. Not isolation, but the awareness of another. In the Psalms, it is said, not just be still, but be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46. True silence is God awareness. So if you notice me pausing during some parts of our worship at St. Thomas, I'm just trying to bring about God awareness in us, which comes to us greatly in silence. Some images, I just decided to throw these in here. Again, no big stained glass window, but just an open one above with the sunlight shone in each and every afternoon for Compline and Vespers at the monastery. Some images of the ground there, because of course the monks took really good care of the property. You're always welcome to be there. And an image, someone sent me an article from America Magazine, which is a Jesuit magazine, about the death of one of the monks, Father Joseph. Actually, his name is Father Mary Joseph Spito. And he grew up in Chicago and had been a monk for 79 years. He joined the monastery just a few years after Thomas Merton did, and knew Thomas Merton in Gethsemane. And in 1953, they told him they were sending him to South Carolina, and he's been there ever since. And you would see Father Joseph, who was, or Brother Joseph, he was a lay monk, not an ordained monk. And you would see Brother Joseph out with his squirrels. And as the monks would tell you, Brother Joseph came originally from a Polish family, and he spoke to the squirrels at Meccan in Polish, which they seemed to understand quite well. And they would literally come and eat the peanuts right out of his hands. And he was such a wonderful image of what a lifelong monk can be like and can become, because he never had anything other than a smile on his face and was always very welcoming and hospitable. And it was sad to hear that he had passed away at the age of 97. So there you go, 79 years in the monastery, a good long life with the Brothers of Meccan all the way up to the end. And these are the final photos of that. Here was an image of all of us in the Monastic Institute. That's a guy. Yes, I had facial hair back then. By the way, you noticed that. I shaved that off a while back, and a good group of us. And a final quote to you, one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain. It speaks to me of what makes the monastic life still essential to this country, wherever it's found, in the Catholic tradition or in our own tradition. But it says, the eloquence of this liturgy was even more tremendous. And what it said was one simple, cogent, tremendous truth. This church, the court of the Queen of Heaven, is the real capital of the country in which we are living. This is the center of all the vitality that is in America. This is the cause and reason why the nation is holding together. These men, hidden in anonymity, of their choir and their white cows are doing for their land what no army, no Congress, no president could ever do as such. They are winning for it the grace and the protection and the friendship of God. This is what calls Thomas Merton to leave everything. He's a very wise, smart, prolific writer, and become a Cistercian monk. He did it because he gave up all the political and the earthly draws of this world and went to pray for this world in the monastic community. And I agree with him. What would we be like if we did not have these communities praying for each and every one of us 7 times a day? Think about that as Christians, the amount of prayer being offered for all of us. And how, as Merton says, that's what really holds us together. So I think Merton was right on that. So that brings us to the end. I went back, I dealt with COVID. I decided that COVID had given me a sense of God calling me somewhere else, and lo and behold, here I am in Huntsville, Alabama with all of you. So that's my story. And if you have any questions, I have played this all the way up to you have only a few minutes to ask him. Next week, just before I open the floor up for that, we will have more time to talk because I'm planning on telling you about a class I'm going to start in the Lenten series. So that obviously won't take as much time. So there'll still be time for questions if you go home and you think about what I said about monks and nuns, and you've got more questions about that, bring them next week. But any questions to wrap up this journey of faith that has brought me to be here with you, or anything that you might tie in with that? Any of you ever been on a retreat in a monastic or convent? Okay. Sally.
You know about St. Mary's.
What's that?
You know about St. Mary's, it's one.
Yes, I do. Yes, that's right. I talked about Coleman, Alabama, but I also know I'm very close to the Holy Mountain, which is Swanee. And I need to go see the Sisters of St. Mary's as well.
And also, there are several men in Huntsville still, where you're older, and I'll give you some of the names later, who for a number of years would go to the seminary for a week.
Yeah.
And they're not all just service with the seminary.
Yeah.
And the different denominations.
Yeah, the monastic community is very open to anyone. We had, if you think to yourself, oh, all those people in that monastic community either were some sort of religious clergy like Father Donavan, or were Roman Catholics. It was interesting. We had at least one guy that was very into Zen Buddhism, and a few people that were from the very evangelical tradition. I mean, it was very open. The monks would tell you they're not interested in what your religious faith is or whether you have one or not. They want you to come and experience what they do, and they're very welcoming of all of that. And they cover their ground by saying to us Protestants in their midst that even though the Catholic tradition does not allow for Protestants to receive communion, they were not going to check our cards during our time. And so that allowed us to all be able to take Holy Communion throughout our time there. It would have been essential to me. I couldn't have done it if I couldn't have taken it with the monks. But again, the monks are a little more, progressive, I suppose, than some of them. Then you would expect them to be as monks and nuns. Questions or comments? Covered all my ground. Yes, John.
If you were to have the opportunity to take another sabbatical, say 5 years from now, any idea what you would like to do in the future? Would you go back and revisit? Would you want to do something different?
That's a good question. I'm not 100% for sure, and I think that's important because God may have a different direction for me in 5 to 7 years from now, whenever it is allowed to occur, if it does get to occur again. I hope so. I really enjoyed that time, but if my wife were here and she's home with my daughter who's a little sick today, she would tell you that it wasn't all easy going. I had my moments when I wanted to drive through the gate and bust out. And when I felt like I just wanted some free time, I'd been very open for a month when we were in Ireland, and then I knew I was going to have close to a month when I got finished with the Institute. And, you know, the sense of wanting some free time I missed. So I struggled at Neptune a few times and thought, man, what am I, was this the right decision to make? But that's usually a sign you're doing the right thing. If you're struggling, it's usually a good sign that it's really having a serious impact you will take with you. So, long-winded way of saying I don't know what I would do again. You know, I thought about going to another community, but you know, it depends on what's up. I just was a Holy Spirit moment to find out that they had a program where I could learn and pray and stay and be fed and do all that stuff for an entire month. So it was really a wonderful experience, and it really fit well into my sabbatical. Next time I have a sabbatical, I may want more free time and just go stay on the beach somewhere. A couple months, but thanks. Other thoughts or questions? If none, next week, come back. I'm going to keep going. I'll have some room for more questions to get started with. No more stories, no more pictures to tell unless you ask me about them. And then I want to talk to you about the next class I plan to teach, which is the 20 verses of Holy Scripture that I think every Christian should know. So that started out as 15, and then it grew to 20, and it may be 25 this time. But right now I'm sticking with 20. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that, and hopefully I'll be able to talk to you about our Lenten series that will kick in when Lent begins, which, believe it or not, is 1 week from this Wednesday. So yeah, come celebrate with me, and then come back on Tuesday and have pancakes and gumbo, because Lent is almost here. Anybody watch Game of Thrones? Remember, winter is coming. Lent is coming. So get ready. All right. Thank you.